Even people deeply committed to nonviolence have to grapple with the fact that much of our lives are structured by violence. Think about the phrase law and order. There's this implicit assumption that order is established through the application of force. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek talks about an invisible background of systemic violence. So is it hypocritical for those of us who live in societies predicated or built upon violence to say we claim an ethic of nonviolence? Shouldn't we just be honest about the fact that our lives are made possible by violence? Again, I turn to the example of Jesus. Part of what happens at the cross is that Jesus reveals the violence inherent in the Pax Romana, or the peace of Rome. Rome, when it conquered peoples, claimed it was establishing peace, but it was establishing peace through often brutal violence. And at the cross, Jesus reveals this contradiction inherent in the Roman system, that what they called peace was actually brutality. And for those of us who follow in the ways of Jesus, this is an ongoing challenge for us, to be honest about the ways that violence is present in our lives and in our culture and in our society, and to continually be working to reveal that violence and to undo that violence. Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, famously remarked that we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Is it possible to square this logic with the tenets of non-resistance? Does non-resistance require neutrality, that we avoid taking sides? The challenge of non-resistance is not pretending that there is no evil in the world. Certainly there is evil in the world, and followers of Christ are called to respond to that evil. So it's not a matter of studious neutrality, trying to imagine ourselves as being above the fray of conflict in human life. The question is, how do we enter into or engage with those conflicts? The example we find in Jesus is not that Jesus is neutral in situations of injustice. Jesus is clear that there is injustice in the world and that it needs to be rectified or made right. But the way that Jesus goes about it is not by condemning the perpetrators of injustice, but by inviting them into divine communion. This is the way the theologian Miroslav Volf describes it. He says, God does not abandon the godless to their evil, but gives the divine self for them in order to receive them into divine communion through atonement. So as those of us who are committed to non-resistance encounter situations of injustice and oppression and evil, we don't approach them from a posture of neutrality, but even as we recognize dynamics of injustice, we do so in such a way that invites all parties, both perpetrator and victim, oppressed and oppressor, to encounter the transformative and saving grace of Christ. This is the most common question that gets asked of people who are articulating the New Testament view of violence. And so I want to spend a little bit more time with this question and address it in three ways. First, to try to answer the question, but then to question the question, to interrogate it psychologically and to interrogate it spiritually. The most direct way I can answer this question is to simply admit that I don't know. None of us knows how we would respond in a high-stress, high-pressure, dangerous situation. The best we can do is try to prepare ourselves. I admire the way that Ron Sider, a theologian and activist, answers this question by saying he would begin by shouting at the intruder, "In the name of Jesus, stop." Sometimes we as Christians don't seem to actually put our faith into action in believing in the power of Christ to intervene in a situation. I also hope that I would be prepared to intervene with my own body, to put my own body in harm's way rather than see harm come to my loved ones. This seems to be the example of Jesus, who was willing to die rather than kill. But I simply don't know how I actually would respond in a situation like this. Honestly, this question breaks my heart. The fact that for so many people, when they think of Christianity, what they think about is genocide and forced conversion. For 1700 years, far too many Christians have been willing to engage in violence and even justify that violence on the basis of their faith. But that 1700 years is not the entirety of the Christian story. For the first 300 years of its existence, the Christian church was almost universally nonviolent. The early followers of Jesus were committed to doing exactly what Jesus called them to do, loving their enemies and praying for those who persecuted them. Much of that legacy has been obscured by later acts of bloodshed and violence, and so it's paramount for those of us who are seeking to follow Jesus faithfully and invite others to follow Jesus that we reclaim this legacy of nonviolence. This is our heritage as followers of Jesus. Violence done in the name of Jesus does not represent the Jesus of Scriptures or the legacy of the early church. And so a commitment to nonviolence is a way that we bear witness to Jesus in this world. Defining violence is a key part of the work of nonviolence, and it certainly is a moving target. What we understand to be violence changes over time. Think about a phrase like silence is violence. That might have been incomprehensible a few generations ago, but we intuit what that means today. If you're interested in this question, particularly from a Mennonite perspective, there's a fascinating study of Mennonite peace rhetoric over the course of 100 years called From Non-Resistance to Justice, written by Irvin Stutzman, and it traces shifts in how Mennonites have spoken and talked about violence. Perhaps one way to understand the changes in the definition of violence is to think of it as moving upstream in a river, trying to find the source or the head. Often we deal with the downstream effects of injustice or dysfunction that manifest themselves as violence. And so we see an objective instance of violence, an objective instance of someone harming someone else, and we say, oh, that's violence. But there's this desire to move upstream and understand what provoked that violence, what led to that violence. And as we move upstream, can we understand the circumstances that give rise to violence? And if we work to address those circumstances, can we actually diminish the amount of violence in the world? So it's an ongoing process to understand not just what violence is, but where violence comes from. So why is this question so common? Why do so many people raise this particular hypothetical when they hear the New Testament teaching on violence? I've noticed that this question tends to be asked by people who have not lived through very much real violence in their lives. It comes from people who have lived relatively tranquil, relatively peaceful lives. And it makes me wonder, what is it about our psyche that raises this question to the surface? Why do we presume the world is more violent than we have personally experienced it to be? So it's worth reflecting on the media that we consume, the conversations that we have, the stories that we tell, the heroes that we glorify, to understand the way that this presumption of violence has wormed its way into our psyches, even when our lives have been very, very peaceful. Perhaps rather than focusing on such horrifying but unlikely hypotheticals, our energy would be better invested reflecting on the things that the church in Philippi was called to reflect on. That if anything is true, or anything is noble, if anything is right or pure or lovely, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, that's what we should be thinking about, not horrific acts of violence. What does asking this question say about our spirituality, our faith, or our beliefs? The theologian Walter Wink says that if a God is what we turn to when all else fails, then violence certainly functions as a God in our society. And you can hear that in this question. Implicit in this question is the belief that violence alone can solve the problem of violence. And for followers of Jesus, this is a big problem for us to think and believe in these ways. What it means is that we are putting our faith not in the providential mercies of God, but we are putting our faith in our ability to exercise superior force or greater violence. So this is not just a wrong-headed belief, it is an idolatrous belief. We are putting our hope and faith and trust in violence rather than in God alone. So there's a continual challenge set before followers of Jesus to actually trust in Jesus, to put our faith in God rather than putting our faith in our own power or our own violence. Well, yes and no. Romans 13 is a key text that seems to open the door for state-sanctioned violence. What's important to note about Romans 13, though, is that Paul does not seem to be envisioning Christians participating in the mechanisms of state violence. In essence, if the state sanctions violence, Christians are presumed to be outside of the state. That's not to say, though, that the New Testament and the early church do not critique state violence. The death of Jesus itself is an indictment of the injustice of state-sponsored violence. Then you have other early church leaders like Cyprian sarcastically remarking that murder, considered a crime when people commit it individually, is transformed into a virtue when they do it en masse. So if we want to draw a distinction between state-sponsored and personal violence, there are two things that are important to remember. One is that Christians are not given permission in the New Testament or in the example of the early church to participate in violence, even if it is state-sanctioned. And second, there is an implicit and sometimes explicit critique of state violence that comes both through the life of Jesus, the writings of the New Testament, and the example and witness of the early church. World War II is certainly the closest thing we find in the modern era to a just war. Just war theory was something developed by very serious Christian thinkers to try to establish a limiting principle for violence. When is violence an acceptable alternative to doing nothing? But what this question presumes is that there are essentially only two options: respond to violence with violence or do nothing. The New Testament authors in the early church, in contrast, seem to believe that there was always another way. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans 12, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And so this is the challenge that is ever before us as followers of Christ. How do we live faithfully in a violent world when we are confronted with evil? How do we respond to evil without being overcome by it? How do we respond to evil without becoming evil? Can we always be thinking about ways to overcome evil with good? The phrase Christian nonviolence is not meant to be exclusionary or have an air of superiority. There are plenty of folks of other faiths and of no faith who are admirable practitioners of nonviolence. What makes Christian nonviolence distinct is its objective or goal. Christian nonviolence is not primarily a strategy for social change. Although social change happens when followers of Christ commit ourselves to nonviolence, that's not the primary objective. Instead, Christian nonviolence is part of a process of discipleship. It is a way we become more like Christ. This is the objective of the Christian life. In the language of Ephesians, it is that we would grow up in every way into Him who is the head, that is, into Christ. The disciplines of Christian nonviolence, seeking to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, these are ways that we participate in the life of God and become conformed into the example of Jesus Christ. Christian nonviolence is about discipleship. It's about becoming more like Christ.